Hello, and welcome to a very quick wrap-up, I hope, of The Hidden Family by Charles Stross. This is the number 2 in the Mercantile Prince's fantasy. It's a fantasy, it's completely and utterly fantasy, even though Stross has written science fiction. In the past I've only read his science fiction. This is pure fantasy. Number 1 is the family trade. And I hear from the internet that you can buy a volume that contains number 1 and number 2 together. If you're interested in getting into this series, I would strongly recommend you do that. Number 1 is unapologetically not a book in its own right. On its very last page, the last sentence is, "Time would show otherwise, ... It continues immediately in The Hidden Family. There is no plot or story arc that finishes in number 1. Number 2 does a bit better. It does actually have something approaching a story arc finish, which is good. It's still got lots of anachronisms, inconsistencies, and so forth, but not as bad as number 1. It definitely had better proofreading. You don't have things... You don't have these discussions of people slipping who never slipped and so forth in number 2. That's something. In it, we've got Miriam Bergstein, Jewish American, or so I find out. Ordinary businesswoman. Charles Stross seems fascinated with the phrase .com. I've never heard .com used as an adjective, but apparently it's a thing. At least for him. Maybe it was a thing in the early 2000s. I don't remember it being so, but maybe I just wasn't paying attention. So Miriam's discovered that she's actually got... She always thought she was adopted, and she's discovered she's got the blood that will allow her to travel from this world by staring at a Celtic knot design into another world. Where she's actually a countess or something, and she belongs to these clans who've got this inherited ability to travel between worlds. That means that they're basically going to own her life from now on. Everything else that I say in this will be spoilers. If you don't want spoilers and you think you're going to read them. Overall, I wouldn't say don't do it. If you love fantasy and you love world traveling fantasy, and if you love having a female protagonist, what's that index people talk about? The Bechdel, sounds like Bechamel index. This is probably for you. Our main protagonist is a female. There is a kind of a bit of a love story, but it's not too dominant. You've got plenty of women talking to other women, but where men aren't present about things that aren't men, okay? Anyway, it's not as frenetic and it's not as frantic. The storylines do actually make a little bit more sense than they do in the first one. And some of them are quite interesting and involving in their own. I would have liked still to hear more about world building. We don't get as much as I would have liked of world building. But yeah, so Miriam, first of all, spoiler of mass destruction. One of the things I hated about number 1 was how Miriam had a good relationship with her adoptive mother and then completely ignored her for the entire book. In this one, she finally goes out for lunch with her aged and disabled mother, and I've got to say that from the first meeting, I don't even know if Stross was trying to make this a hidden plot, but I defy anyone not to see coming that Iris is actually her real mother, not her adoptive mother, who came originally from excuse me, who came originally from this Viking-esque medieval world that Miriam's just discovered and hid there with her baby. That's Miriam. Also known as Helge, Countess Helge on the other side. So that storyline ends about 2/3 in, which is nice. That's actually not a bad plot line. There's an overall plot here. Miriam has discovered that the assassin, at least some of the assassins who keep trying to kill her off, are from this third world, and she discovers that the clan of 6 or 5, a clan of 5 families used to be 6. There used to be a younger brother called something Chinese, Lee, maybe. He went off into the west in this alternative world, which she starts to call world number 1. She calls ours number 2. She calls the third one number 3. So in world number 1, He's sent out into the east to discover new trade routes and new propositions. When he gets there, he has some trouble. He loses his locket. He eventually redraws it, but he redraws it a little bit differently. That lets him slip through into this world number 3. So we've got 3 worlds. We've got one that is very much number 1, which is basically where the clans are from and where they're strongest. That is their feudal level society, but it keeps importing interesting toys from ours. Ours is world number 2. It's a post-industrialized tech world, and then you've got world number 3, which is the world that Lee accidentally discovered by misdrawing the Celtic cross knot work, and that one is Industrial Revolution level, and the history is very different. So we've got 3 different histories of Earth and how they could come about. One thing that Miriam says, or Charles Stross says through his medium of Miriam, that I thought was really interesting is, as a throwaway line we get, that she thinks that the difference in history and how the Industrial Revolution came about is probably going to be the key to understanding the differences between the worlds. It doesn't go anywhere in this book. I expect it goes on in one of the other books. There are at least 2 more that I know of. One internet location claims that there's something like 9. I enjoy the story concept enough that maybe one day I'll read it, but I'm not wild for it because the writing is basic. And while I don't dislike Miriam as much in this book as I did in the first one, I don't think it's a good enough fantasy for me to actively pursue it when I've already got so much to read. There's better fantasy out there. I do really like his core concepts. Oh dear, it's going to be a noise in a second. I like his core concepts. Now, Miriam decides that she has to establish a business in world number 3 in order to prove to the clans in world number 1 that she's a competent adult. It's shady and it's weak and it's not well explained. It wouldn't have been my first thought. And Miriam, as a successful entrepreneur, is never convincing. And her running between the worlds, establishing offices and business and so forth, it's not well developed, in my opinion. So in our world, she's got her friend Paulie, who also was fired from her previous job in book number 1, buying these offices to establish a business. Except I don't notice that any business is ever established. I don't even know really why they're there. And then she goes into world number 3 and finds a house. So it can be a safe house. That means you can transfer between these 2 worlds in a doppelgangered area, so it's safe on both sides. No world walkers can come through. I love having birds. Come on, sweetheart. The idea of the doppelgangered houses is absolutely a good idea, and I enjoyed it very much in both book number 1 and book number 2. The establishing businesses doesn't seem consistent, however, and Miriam is very unconvincing as a successful entrepreneur. She's just too random and too weird, and the necessity for the things that she does is often never explained. A couple of the things that are never explained throughout the book make a sort of sense in the end, but they don't seem premeditated, except maybe by the author. The author may have planned out what's going to happen, and that's why he has these things come around, but they seem very Deus Ex Machina when they actually happen. They've been designed to get her out of trouble. And still, at least there's a conclusion. They have this big family meeting, and the surprise visitor is Miriam's mother, Iris, who was actually used to be the countess of whatever they're countess of, Hajol something, I think. Or is it Lofstrom, Hajol? Something vaguely Norwegian sounding. And because she's there, and because Miriam sticks up for herself and she's created this business, she's just they decide she's a competent adult, they allow her to continue her business. And the final scene in this book is one of those fun, we're having a party to celebrate our business success, and all my friends are coming, even though I didn't think they would, yay. It's a satisfying ending, as endings go. Yeah, not wild about it. If you're planning on reading it, I definitely recommend looking for one of the novels I've heard that are online 2-in-1. That way, at least you'll get some sense of a finished story at the end of the book you own. I gather that number 3 and 4 can also be gotten a 2-in-1, so I'm guessing if I ever consider continuing on to number 3, I should make sure I've got 3 and 4, because I'm going to guess that 3 has no ending. Wikipedia tells me that there are something like 9 in the series. I'm ambivalent. On one hand, they're good, they're fantasy and they're pretty good, and I love the core concept. On the other hand, the writing isn't amazing. The main character is someone I couldn't put up with rather than enjoy. A lot of her actions seem meaningless. And the thing that I'm really interested in, which is the world building on world number 1, where you've got this feudal Viking-based type society, that's the thing I'm really interested in. And that's the thing I actually get the least of. I get much more of Marion traipsing around with a headache all the time. So I'm not sure. It's not bad. I'd probably give the first book now 2 stars out of 5. I'd probably give the second book maybe 3 stars out of 5. Overall, I enjoyed it, and it had an actual plot and an actual ending. So overall, if this was one novel, they'd probably get 3 stars. Probably more for other people than for me, but I have to say that as I get older, I get more critical and more willing to low-rate books, less willing to put up with inconsistencies and poor writing, which, you know, there's a fair bit of poor writing in here. Poor editing, more in number 1 than in number 2, and inconsistencies. Like, there's one character who can't world walk from part of all of the first book, and then part of the first book, and then all of a sudden she can't. I'm sure there's explanations. Maybe they're coming in book number 3. I don't care about them that much. There's too much that doesn't make sense for me to assume that one thing that doesn't make sense is going to be explained later. Just saying. I also got to say, one of my favourite walking books, which is Marion Zimmer Bradley's A House Between Worlds. If I encountered that as my young teens, and I adore it, if I encountered it now, I'd probably be every bit as critical of that as I am of these two. If I'd have encountered these when I was younger, I would probably have absolutely 5-star adored them. And if you are in your 20s and you're just starting in your fantasy reading, you will probably enjoy these a lot more than I have. And if you've been reading a lot of young adult, these are absolutely better because you have adult characters doing adult things, and you don't have that repetition and writing and superficiality that is often present in young adult books. So yes, if you've always read young adult books, fantasy books, and you're starting to feel that they're not satisfying, maybe try Charles Stross, The Merchant Princes. If you're old and cynical like me, maybe don't. Okay, thank you for watching. Next video I post will be quite different from previous ones, and also probably pretty short. Thank you for watching. Read good books.